January 26th is celebrated by some as the birth of a nation, yet for many it marks the beginning of an unhealed wound. In 1788, 11 British ships arrived in Botany Bay, led by Captain Arthur Phillip. Soon after, at Sydney Cove in Port Jackson, the Union Jack was raised, the land was claimed, the colony established, and the date, January 26th, would eventually be commemorated as Australia Day. But this wasn't unclaimed land. It wasn't random land they just stumbled upon. It was home to hundreds of Aboriginal nations. 230 years later, Australia stands at a turning point, facing hard questions about justice, identity, and what it truly means to reconcile. Because this history isn't over, it's alive. And if we are to move forward, we must first be brave enough to look back. Welcome to Unveiled History. Back then, the land was called New South Wales, and it was chosen for punishment. In 1786, the British government, desperate to relieve overcrowded prisons, chose this distant, unknown continent for a penal colony. Captain Arthur Phillip, appointed to lead the expedition, was given a nearly impossible task. Build a new society at the edge of the world with barely any resources, little knowledge of the land, and no experienced farmers to feed the colony. His requests for proper support were denied, and his funding was minimal. The people he was bringing, over 700 convicts and just a handful of Marines, were not prepared for the hardship ahead. The voyage alone took 8 grueling months, claiming the lives of dozens before the first step was ever taken on Australian soil. And when they finally arrived, things only got harder. The soil was poor, the climate was unfamiliar, the colony was starving. The soldiers meant to maintain order weren't up to the task, and the line between survival and collapse was razor thin. Captain Phillip, harsh, pragmatic, but unusually progressive for his time, believed there would be no slavery in this new land. He promoted some convicts to positions of authority. He kept order through floggings and hangings, but also laid the groundwork for something resembling egalitarianism. And over time, the struggling outpost found its footing. Phillip returned to England in 1792, but the colony he helped create remained. By the early 1800s, prosperity had begun to grow, and with it, a kind of patriotism. Men began to look back on January 26th as their beginning. In 1808, they toasted to the anniversary with drinking and revelry. 10 years later, it became official that January 26th would be a holiday, but not everyone was celebrating. For Aboriginal Australians, the date marked something entirely different. It was the start of the invasion, and so, as Australia Day rose, so did another name, Invasion Day. The British didn't see them, or rather, they chose not to. They declared the land terra nullius, meaning belonging to no one. And under that lie, Aboriginal land was taken without a treaty, without consent, or recognition. What followed was a loss of lives, language, and connection to country. A colonial doctrine built on the belief that European culture was superior, so superior it had the right to erase others. And yet, through massacres, forced removals, and decades of systematic erasure, Aboriginal people survived. They fought back in what came to be known as the Frontier Wars. The Frontier Wars were part of a long, bloody campaign stretching across the continent, including massacres, ambushes, open battles, and acts of defiance against a force that refused to acknowledge their humanity. The violence lasted well over a century. Officially, the wars were said to have ended in 1934. But ask anyone in the Aboriginal community and they'll tell you that the violence never really stopped. It just changed shape. Historians estimate that between 2,000 to 5,000 colonists were killed during these years. But the number of Aboriginal deaths is impossible to know. Many were never recorded, others were covered up. In what is now called Queensland alone, it is estimated that over 60,000 Aboriginal people were killed. Nationwide, the death toll may have wiped out up to 90% of the Aboriginal population at the time of the invasion. Killed not only by bullets and poison, but by foreign diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, and influenza. Illnesses the colonists brought with them against which the Aboriginal peoples had no immunity. One of the most brutal episodes of this era was the Black War in Tasmania. It began in 1824 and stretched on for 7 violent years. By its end, the Aboriginal population on the island had been nearly wiped out. Official records speak of around 1,000 killed, but the truth is likely far worse. During the Black War, a British official named Lieutenant Governor George Arthur declared martial law. What does that mean? It gave settlers the right to act like soldiers, with full, legal power. In short, if they killed an Aboriginal person, they couldn't be arrested. It was a free pass to commit violence without consequence. In 1830, the colonists formed a terrifying force known as the Black Line, where over 2,000 men marched in formation, sweeping across the land and driving Aboriginal clans from their homes. The goal was to kill or remove every remaining Aboriginal Tasmanian. Many were shot on sight. Others were captured and exiled to remote peninsulas, never to return. To many, this was genocide, yet still, they survived, and the massacres continued elsewhere. In 1834, in what is now Western Australia, colonists attacked a group of around 80 men, women and children, many of them from the Binjareb people. The colonists were led by the governor himself, James Sterling. Somewhere between 15 and 30 Aboriginal people were killed that day. Meanwhile, in Queensland, it got worse. In 1842 and again in 1847, colonists gifted flour to local Aboriginal clans. But this flour was laced with strychnine, a deadly poison. The result? Around 140 Aboriginal people died from just those 2 acts of chemical slaughter. And in the Northern Territory, as late as 1923, violence was still erupting. The Coniston Massacre began after a colonist, Fred Brooks, was killed, reportedly after he violated Walpiri marriage laws and possibly assaulted a woman. In response, the revenge party was led by a mounted police officer named George Murray. Over several months, they hunted and killed over 60 Aboriginal people from the Walpiri, Amatea and Kaitetia communities, including women and children. It's considered one of the last officially recorded massacres of the frontier wars. But the violence didn't stop when the guns did. It just found new forms in policies and paperwork. In 1937, the government held a national meeting and decided that Aboriginal people, not of full blood, should be assimilated. What did this mean? It meant slowly erasing Aboriginal identity, forcing people to live like white Australians, to forget their language, their traditions, their way of life. The goal was to make them disappear into the population. Laws followed. Aboriginal children were sent to separate schools, if they were allowed to go at all. They were banned from towns after dark, no alcohol, no social security, often not even fair pay. Worst of all, some laws gave governments, not parents, control over Aboriginal children. And that's how the stolen generations began. From the 1800s to the 1970s, thousands of children were taken, some on their way to school, others straight from their homes. They were raised in institutions or white foster homes, They were raised in institutions or white foster homes, punished for speaking their language, and cut off from family and culture. Even before this, the Constitution excluded them. Until 1967, Aboriginal people weren't even counted in the population. It wasn't until 1992, in the Mabo case, that the terra nullius was finally overturned. The court finally ruled that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had a continuing connection to their land, and that native title could exist. This meant that under certain conditions, Aboriginal groups can be legally recognised as traditional owners of land and waters. But it's not full ownership, and it can be taken away or extinguished if governments sell or lease that land. Still, Aboriginal people have always fought back. In the early days of colonisation, warriors like Pemulwuy, a Bidjigal man from the Eora Nation, fought to protect land and people, burning crops and raiding food stores taken by settlers. In Victoria, the Gundit Mara people became known as the Fighting Gundit Mara, standing strong against invasion in the 1800s. Over time, resistance evolved. Community groups and organisations were formed, like the 1925 Australian Aboriginal Progress Association and the 1957 Aborigines Advancement League, fighting for land, rights and justice. Protests and petitions became powerful tools. In 1938, Aboriginal leaders organised the Day of Mourning. In 1988, thousands protested the bicentenary. And in 1937, Uncle William Cooper gathered 1,800 signatures to send a petition to the King, demanding representation in Parliament. Australia's story isn't whole without the truth of its first peoples. Despite fierce resistance, colonisation brought violence, disease and dispossession. Yet Indigenous Australians continue to reclaim, resist and rise.